Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Helping Clients Succeed in the ESG Transition, Unwrapping CS3D. My name is Vitalija Impolevičienė. I'm the head of ESG service line at Sorainen. I will be your moderator for this session. We are delighted to have you with us. Sorainen ESG service line is dedicated to helping clients navigate the ever-evolving landscape of sustainability-related regulations. And today's webinar is part of our ongoing initiative to educate and support our clients and the broader market on ESG matters. We will delve into the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CS3D, and its implications for businesses, supply chains, and compliance strategies. Our expert speakers will provide insights into the latest regulatory developments and their significance for companies operating in the Baltics and beyond, taking into account also the EU Omnibus Simplification Package proposals. We will start today with a presentation by Agita Sprūde from Sorainen, Latvia on the CS3D legal requirements and the impacts and opportunities for Baltic businesses. After that, Christopher Lilholm from DNV will speak on transforming corporate responsibility through proactive supplier engagement. We also have Leah Hiisman, ESG Counsel from Kastren and Snellman attorneys in Finland with us, and Leah will touch upon the Finnish perspective on the changing regulatory field and the need for ESG compliance. We encourage you to actively participate by submitting your questions via the Q&A tool in your Teams application, and our experts will address your questions at the end of the event. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Sorainen website for future reference. Thank you once again for joining us. We hope you will find this session insightful and valuable. And let's get started. Dear Agita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vitalija. It's always great to be talking about CS3D, as it seems that at least here in Latvia, this is a topic that draws wide attention and makes companies try to do something with regards to ESG, as this great directive, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, apparently requires something to be done. Otherwise, there will be a huge penalties. And I think that is a perception that the companies here in Baltics had and have still. So quite a lot of work is being done with regard to prepare the companies for when this CS3D directive comes into the legal force. So what is this Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and what does it require? So it was adopted last year in summer, and it provided that it shall be transposed into the member states' legislation by July 2026, where first companies will have to apply it from July 2027. However, as it required quite a lot of preparation and internal preparation for companies, those companies initially in scope have already started the work, preparatory work to prepare internal processes, and some of the countries already started work implementing the directive. So what is the status of this directive in transposing into the legislation in the Baltic states? In Estonia and Lithuania, the transposition was not started, as far as we know. In Latvia, the transposition was started. Quite many working group meetings were organized, but last 2 weeks it was paused as Omnibus came out, and it was decided that it's better to wait out how the Omnibus progresses and whether or not it will be adopted and whether or not something will change in a scope and in a timeline of this CS3D directive. So currently, none of the legislative initiatives in Baltic states are moving forward. They are all pausing and waiting to see what will happen in Europe with Omnibus directive. And I will later speak on about the Omnibus and what does it entail. But first, what obligations and what is CS3D key facts and what obligations does it require from the companies? First, why it was essential for the companies to do something, it was because it is established a corporate due diligence in the value chains of a company, meaning it's not only supply chains, but it's also upstream and downstream clients and suppliers. So the company had a wide range of activities to be done and followed with regards to a wide range of cooperation partners and clients. Although it was initially direct and so still is directly applicable to more or less large entities, and we can discuss about the scope of these large entities. Indirectly, it would be applicable to also medium and small companies as being part of these value chains of large companies. So essentially, this is a legislation that was intended to be a broad scope of applicability and to touch upon a great number of companies. Initially, there was approximately 16,000 estimated companies to be directly in the scope of this directive, but in the final rounds of negotiations, it was watered down to have only very large companies in scope, meaning companies exceeding 2,000 employees and 450 million euro turnover in Europe, or some other groups have a smaller turnover requirement, but still pretty important. So the estimate is that direct applicability, what trickled down to approximately 5,500 companies in Europe, or approximately 0.5% of all companies operating in European market. And it's even less for the Baltic states. And currently it is thought that it's only a few companies that are directly concerned in each of the Baltic states. So what does this CS3D require? First, essentially, it required the companies to take appropriate assessment of their activities and whether their activities had any environmental and human rights risks down the value chains, and they had to implement a due diligence plans into their internal policies so that they can identify actual or potential adverse impacts on human rights and environmental, so that they can take appropriate actions to prevent and mitigate these potential adverse impacts and actual adverse impacts and minimize them, or to cease cooperation if the adverse impact cannot be minimized. It also required to have a wide range of stakeholder cooperation and engagement to establish and maintain a complaints procedure so that the concerned stakeholders can raise complaints and that it's effective and that their rights are effectively protected, to establish and monitor the effectiveness and regularly monitor the effectiveness of existing due diligence policies and measures, and to publicly also communicate what is being done in the company and what is intended to be done. And for extra large companies, it was also an obligation to create a mandatory climate transition plans aligned with the goals of Paris Agreement, meaning how the company will reduce their CO2 emissions and significantly to not exceed this 1.5 degree increase in global temperature. On paper, it looks simple, but when we look down on how to implement it and what really does it require for the company to how to engage stakeholders in a in a meaningful way. So how to create these procedures that they work, and how to validate the data, and how to store them, how to assess them. It creates a rather large and complex system within the companies. And to motivate the companies doing so, and not just create paperwork that is and paper plans, this directive also provided large sanctions, namely penalties up to the 5% of global turnover, and also civil liability, which was left to the member states to be implemented, but provided that affected persons have right to receive a just and fair compensation for damages. And there must be also a rather long 5-year at least limitation period to bring those claims. So the actual enforcement tools were provided there. So I guess that was the main reason why companies were finally ready to do something actively and to be concerned whether they are doing enough. And we do not see what will happen with those provisions and the main timeline when the directive will come into the force. As stated earlier in February, Omnibus 1 and Omnibus 2 proposals were adopted. However, for now, the directive remains in force, because Omnibus 1 and Omnibus 2 are both still at the proposal stage, currently being very actively negotiated. But with regards to CS3D, the main currently known fact is that they try to delay the application, at least to postpone it from 2027 to 2028. And to 2029 for the second wave of companies. It also currently intends to limit the due diligence obligation only with regard to direct suppliers, imposing ongoing vigilance requirements, but not requiring to do the due diligence in the full supply chain. Also, the penalties is intended to be perhaps proportional to each company and no longer tied to the global turnover of the company group. Compliance monitoring also is more relaxed, and if previously it was required that these due diligence procedures and policies have to be monitored each year to see whether something needs to be amended. Now it's to be reviewed every 5 years. And also there is no longer requirement to terminate the business relationships if the adverse impact is detected and could not be corrected. And also certain stakeholder engagement is limited, and the company has less obligations to involve NGOs and trade unions in its stakeholder engagement obligations. But of course, we'll see how this goes, because there's different states with different interests, and companies and NGOs And let's see how the negotiations turn down, and what will be the end result and its impact on the CS3D as it is. So moving to the Baltic businesses, how are they concerned, and what is it that the companies in Baltic states most likely are doing and can be done to prepare for CS3D in this period of uncertainty between the existing obligations and potential impact of the omnibus directives? Well, as stated, only very few companies in Baltic states are directly concerned, and most of them are small and medium enterprises which are in the middle of the value chains. So for these large companies, they are in one group, and most likely they have already implemented certain policies, and more likely are working on creating proper systems and procedures and tools to create due diligence processes more effectively. But whether for those small and medium enterprises, the key is key work currently is to prepare the companies for when these large companies will ask questions from them. So most of the SMEs in Baltic states are trying to understand what are they doing already with regards to ESG, what is their situation, whether they are doing something, whether they are following some certifications and some systems are already in place, whether they have proper policies, and whether they are collecting data from their own clients. How are they storing this data, whether they have internal resources to even do so and collect this information, whether they have a special personnel designed to have some part of workload for this data processing, because if they are receiving one request per month from a large company, that's one thing. But if you are receiving like multiple requests per week to collect certain data or provide certain data, that's a different thing, which creates a different burden, administrative burden on these companies. And it's also a question whether all the information is requested in the same manner, or every time a different data is requested. So the data collection starts from the beginning. Also, some of the small and medium enterprises are seeing that they are being audited by the large entities, and some are seeing also on-site audits, namely with regard to environmental controls and processes, labor law requirement compliance, and so on. As we see, the key to success is that there should be a quality data that is easily obtained, easily verifiable, validated, and easily obtained. And this quality data can only be obtained through proper internal processes and controls. And currently, the companies who have done their homework, or who already are part of some other initiatives having necessary certifications within their industries, are in a better starting position, as already they have the base of the data that they can provide. So they are more interested in as the partners for these large companies who are looking for a trusted cooperation partners whose data they can validate, so they can fulfill their own due diligence obligations. So to summarize, what are the key elements on how to prepare for a CS3D is for each company, regardless of the size, to do their own risk assessment and to understand what kind of suppliers do they have, and what kind of partners, clients do you have, and whether or not they are likely to ask something from you, and whether or not you have something to ask from your suppliers. Also, what are your the company should do a quick risk assessment to see what are the risks that you are facing, what are the likely risks within the human rights, from the human rights perspective. In our countries, those are most likely regarding labor law, safety, and tax compliance perspectives there. Also, environment issues are highly topical, especially with regard to pollution, with regard to polluted waters, and use of different packaging materials that are recyclable or not non-recyclable. Then, based on this preliminary assessment, the companies will have to to adopt the decisions, what kind of data they are going to collect, or if they are going to do inspections with their suppliers, what kind of inspections are you doing, whether the contract allows you to do such inspections, and whether to do or not to do, whether perhaps to outsource it, whether the risk is just not there and there is no worse than spending time and resources going into these inspections, whether you are likely to receive the inspections, and what are going to be the consequences of these inspections, whether you have to implement something, some new procedures, and improve the facilities to receive those inspections. If the inspections are being done, then there should be a system, so it's in systemic done in a systemic manner, that it can be replicated and analyzed from year to year, from partner to partner. And of course, if it's a time to renegotiate the contracts, it's a question whether or not the contracts even allow you to request this information, or provide you the obligation to provide this information, and what are the penalties for terminating such contracts, whether new clauses should not be added, or whether or not you should provide some liability transfer clauses. What is your liability if, for example, if your client receives a penalties due to your actions? Is the liability limited or not limited, and so on? Or can you pass this liability further down the value chain? And of course, employee trainings and information and proper internal processes are key to success. And when all this is done, then the companies should be ready to face the CS3D and any other auditing requirements, and learning from the previous mistakes and lessons learned. These internal systems should be regularly reviewed and adopted if necessary, because for everyone, even for the large companies, this is a learning process. This is going to be amended and improved year to year until the right balance is found. Essentially, that is a quick ABC on how to prepare your company, especially if you're a small and medium enterprise in the Baltic states. And I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address those.
Thanks a lot, Agita. Thanks for this overview of the existing requirements of the CS3D, also for shedding some light on the omnibus proposals, and for the Baltic companies' perspective on how they approach those topics. Now let's hear from our next speaker. Our next speaker is Christopher Lilholm, Global Head of Sustainability and ESG Services at DNV Supply Chain and Products Assurance. Welcome, Christopher, and the floor is yours.
Vitalija, thank you very much also to Sorainen for welcoming DNV to talk about proactive supplier engagement and sustainability at large. So thank you for that, and let me take you through who is DNV and how we support the CSDDD. So as mentioned by Vitalija, my role is as a global head of sustainability and ESG services from DNV in our division called Supply Chain and Product Assurance. And before we begin, I like to make a quick disclaimer that DNV is not a legal advisor. So please do not make us responsible legally or financially for any of the decisions linked to this presentation or output. However, we are considered a leader within assurance and providing independent third-party verification and validation services. Disclaimer number 2, and also as presented well by Agita, is the omnibus and the simplification proposals are subject to quite some change right now. So we are providing information as best available to us, but do stay in tune with the trends and the updates that are going on linked to the regulation. Okay, so who are we? As DNV, so let me introduce further here our organization. We are headquartered out of Oslo, and we are a foundation, so we do not have external shareholders. Our purpose is to safeguard life, property, and the environment, and all our units and divisions are working towards that purpose. And as of today, we are now approximately 15,000 colleagues across the DNV areas. And we have existed since 1864, so we celebrate quite a legacy now. We originate as a ship classification society, helping ship owners to de-risk shipbuilding, ship financing, and ship operations, and then taking the risk management approach further, providing assurance into other sectors, and here we are today. When it comes to sustainability and ESG, our mission and goal within supply chain and product assurance is to help our clients to accelerate responsible and credible decarbonization across hard-to-abate sectors. And why is that so? That's because we believe acceleration depends on capital, and it depends on digital. So these are areas where we will be able to support. But it also needs to be without compromising others in the process of decarbonization. So here we also look at other aspects such as human rights, and that's where responsibility is also core. Credibility is key to our services as we rely a lot on independent accreditations, and adding credibility is the much needed to drive the trust from public and from other stakeholders. Finally, decarbonization is critical in climate change mitigation, and we provide also strategies on roadmaps on how to decarbonize. When it comes to the CSDDD, it's part of a more complex regulatory landscape. And at the top of this landscape, we see the EU Green Deal that sort of cascades different requirements for reporting, as well as operational requirements, how to carry out due diligence in practice, how to design products and label products and make claims around products. And there are more regulations than mapped here. But when we then zoom in on the CSDDD, we can say there are 3 core buckets that are of consideration. The human rights aspect, which is linked to the United Nations guiding principles, as well as environmental impacts. So the CSDDD is to ensure no adverse impacts are occurring both on the S in the ESG as well as in the E in the ESG. And finally, also the climate transition plan to make sure that there is an alignment with the Paris Agreement. And yes, the approach here is a due diligence approach, taking first with a risk assessment and a stakeholder engagement, and then ensuring the procedures and the controls to monitor the risks and address them and mitigate such risk. So in a due diligence obligation, we think from the United Nations GP that there are kind of 6 core elements. One is to embed this responsible business conduct into policies and management systems. DNV is providing management system certifications as well. So we do have quite some expertise on that topic. Then it's about understanding the impacts, mitigating them, and then tracking them, as well as the results, and also the communication aspect. Here we believe the credibility and the trustworthiness is very important, and then take remediation when needed. When we look at building for companies to build resilience, we look also beyond compliance. We look at the long term. Yes, we speak about Omnibus. However, Omnibus seems to provide a simplification route, but we think companies are on a long-term journey. Whether it's directly for immediate compliance or not, we do think it is going to build resilience to have quality data of suppliers, to have quality engagement linked to addressing the risk in supply chains, and also having procedures and controls to monitor and report on such. So when we see the Omnibus from that perspective, we can say there are regulatory drivers, but the bus also has a hit by a larger movement, which is the long-term business continuity and brand value and asset value driven by reputation is definitely a factor. So consumers would not like to go with confidence and buy products from brands where they feel guilty that they are contributing to adverse impacts. Investors such as banks, pension funds, and others also wants to be certain that where they place their funds, they are allocated for good purposes or at least not risky business. And finally, tackling sustainability from an ROI perspective, becoming more efficient can also at the same time have an economic impact as well. So managing both becoming leaner and greener simultaneously. We see here a study that 80% of environmental impacts are in the supply chain among the 500 biggest companies. So dealing with supply chain is a critical aspect of dealing with sustainability and ESG. When we look at areas where there can be adverse impacts, they can be from the human rights, there can be biodiversity, can be also worker rights, non-discriminations. It can be the GHG or the greenhouse gas emissions, and as well as water scarcity and pollution. So there can be a multitude of areas to address in terms of risks, as well as possible also opportunities for improvement. And that's why we believe also the engagement of stakeholders is a very important aspect as well. This is about also working actively with the suppliers, allowing them to become better at what they do in terms of mitigating risks, not only providing a compliance check, but also helping them improve over time and resolve such risk. And then also, secondly, is also about having a system to monitor the engagement with the suppliers, so that understanding what are the critical aspects and to prioritize those with the supplier, and form dialogues with them, which can lead to innovation that ultimately will capture opportunities and reduce adverse impacts. So if we summarize this, it's actually about supply chain governance. It's about having a system and a maturity working with very complex global supply chains. And big companies, they have many suppliers. And maybe you are your supplier yourself, supplying a large organization, and this gives an idea what they are looking for. And across supply chain, there is companies trying to tackle their supply chain. Companies have different level of ambition on maturity. And what we have shown here is we have an engagement where we say, based on where the company is on that journey, we can address with specific instruments and tools to help them move forward in a more sustainable way. Sustainability will start also from the point of transparency and trust. This requires also capturing the quality data. I think Agita was talking about the need to succeed is based on having the right procedures and internal processes to make sure you have data in place. And data is basis for improvement, is also for making informed decisions, addressing risk and monitoring risk and reporting the mitigation and remediation of such. Facing suppliers require a due diligence framework. In short, it's just three aspects. There is a governance of it, then there is the operation, and finally the implementation of this framework. So it's really to build this a comprehensive supply chain due diligence framework. A company must identify the risk, design the strategy to respond to the risk, as well as to opportunities, and implement a strong management system to minimize risk throughout the supply chain. Moving forward, we are also entering an era where digital can help us enable and engage the supply chain. So we believe that over time and in the future, AI will drive more quality data and risk assessment as such. That is not to say we can blindly rely on AI, but AI can definitely enable certain data points and data sets and assessment of that. And here we can see data carry different type of categories. That can be public available data, or it can be privatized first-party data that has been cleaned and enriched to encompass a supply chain network. So if we take an example of such, we have a platform now that has 100 million supplier relation that can be mapped accordingly, covering data as product-specific data, supplier key data, as well as logistic data. And over time, this data set of supplier networks will be increasingly enriched and refined. And this will allow beyond the CSDDD to look at the direct suppliers, but also look at the indirect suppliers. In other words, the supplier of your supplier and their suppliers, and also map such risk. So the entire value chain risk becomes better addressed through the use of technology and AI. This is at a governance level, but also at a product communication level. We see another regulation, also part of the EU Green Deal, which is cascading the abundance of data into product communication as well. So when you as a consumer or a customer purchase a product, that might be for B2B or B2C, then there is a new regulation forthcoming called the Digital Product Passport, which is a circular enabler. And the intent here is to carry verified information to the right recipients through a value chain. So it can disclose information on how to recycle a battery, or what the textile origin is, or otherwise serialized data through the different product categories to which it's relevant to communicate more transparency to customers and consumers. Another further engagement model here is to carry out audits, and this is something we as DNV carry out quite substantially throughout the world globally. We provide audits which are on site to come to suppliers, factories, and manufacturing places to inspect and do audits across the world to see the things. We can also provide a hybrid of carrying out remote audits in combination with actual audits. Of course, an audit has to be proportionate to the risk that's trying to address. So starting from a risk assessment is critical in having the audit in a meaningful way. And then there are ways for audits to be done linked to various ISO standards, or linked to third-party certification-specific audits, sector-specific audits, like for the sector of aluminum, There is the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, where audits can be provided, or for steel, it can be responsible steel site certifications. Responsible steel has 13 principles of ethical conduct that is for the site certification to ensure that the human rights are respected and the operations are ethical. So if we are here to summarize what we have covered for today, we have covered quite some topics and aspects into CS3D and how we can go beyond compliance in driving a sustainability journey towards having it as a competitive edge and also building long-term company resilience. So we talk about the management and the governance, understanding risk, understanding who are all your suppliers, and also doing a risk scan that is different based on the different suppliers. What are the inherent risk and identified risk, and how to mitigate such. Also work actively with suppliers on their journey to reduce and mitigate risk and improve their responsibility and sustainability in their operations. Then we talk about traceability, which is about goods shipped across value chains to bring more transparency and trust into those. And of course, the transparency also of the companies providing the goods, such as transparency and credibility in their carbon emissions accounting. Also have a sense check of the targets that the companies are setting linked to their climate transition plans, and providing the due diligence assessment with a level of transparency and trust. And yeah, we see that the way forward building resilience is of course being compliant, but also building a performance, sustainability performance that drives also an ROI lens. So I think these are the key words from my side, and on behalf of DNV, I want to thank Sorainen for inviting us for today. And here are my contacts, and I think it's important to say once more that yes, we are not a law firm or a legal advisor. So yeah, please do seek legal information as needed. And yeah, for anything linked to the topics covered, we are happy to engage further. Thank you very much for having us today.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for your informative presentation. And I really appreciated your insight that proactive supply chain management can be done for direct compliance or not. I'm sure we will discuss this during the Q&A session at the end of our event. I would like to use this opportunity to remind our audience that you can ask questions. You can put your questions via the Q&A tool, and we will address the questions at the end of our session. And now I would like to invite our next speaker, Leah Hiisman, counsel from Castrén and Snellman Attorneys in Finland, to share the insights on changing regulatory field and the need for ESG compliance. Welcome, Leah.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for Sorainen for inviting me here today. So my name is Leah Hiisman. I'm an ESG counsel at Castrén and Snellman Attorneys here in Helsinki. Now, my background is a little bit different from many lawyers. So I have a PhD in human rights due diligence and wrote my PhD specifically on the evolving regulation around due diligence requirements. I was, for example, also part of the EU Commission study group for the EU that the current CS3D regulation is based on. I have a background also in consultancy, so I worked in 3 various Big 4 firms doing ESG compliance, supply chain management, and then the last 2 years before returning to Finland, beginning of last year, I was in Australia where I did ESG M&A and ESG finance for a Big 4 as a director. But now here at Castrén and Snellman, if we're not a familiar firm to you, we are Finland's 2nd biggest law firm and Finland's oldest law firm. We have about 280 employees, of which 160 are lawyers. We are only based here in Helsinki, and acts as a Finnish law firm. But we have over 1,000 partner firms in 90 countries and work closely with many firms such as Sorainen around the world. One of the things we're most proud about is we are always the most attractive law firm, the law firm partner and employer for 16 years running in Finland. And we every year attract hundreds of trainees to work with us throughout the year. Now, one of the things we're also quite different from other firms is the fact that we have an ESG practice, 3+1 size practice here at Castrén & Snellman that specifically does ESG compliance. And the reason why we have ESG compliance in the firm is this. The last few years have been very busy when it comes to ESG regulation. Some would call it a tsunami or a tidal wave of ESG regulation that has come from the EU and impacted companies of different sizes, different sectors, and even companies outside the EU. Now, the European Green Deal at its heart wants to make sure that EU is a sustainable business area where we have the possibility to ensure that investments specifically go to sustainable businesses. And that has then manifested itself into various types of regulation. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're going to stick to CS3D, but I think it's important to remember that at the heart, there is a lot of various legal requirements currently. And Omnibus, that I will touch on at the end only impacts currently 4 regulations: CS3D, CSRD, partly taxonomy, and also then slightly some others. But deforestation, forced labor regulation, EMCO, the empowering consumers for the green transition, packaging waste are not currently part of Omnibus. Similarly, SFDR, for those working in the finance sector, may see some changes, but they are currently not yet public. So there's a lot of changes coming, whether you are transporting and importing goods to the EU under the deforestation and forced labor, or whether you are doing consumer marketing. One of the things we work very closely with and have seen in the last few years, and specifically this year, is what you can actually say. What you can say about your goods, whether they are responsible, sustainable, green, and that is going to see quite a big shift in many countries around Europe. And it's good to remember that CS3D is one part of this huge line of various regulation. So when we now start talking about ESG compliance, it goes much further than just CSRD or CS3D. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because they were greatly already covered by the last presenters. But I think it is good to remember that at the heart of CS3D is that due diligence. Now, when we talk about what we're seeing here in Finland, obviously there is a big movement to become compliant with CS3D. But that scope of regulation that we're currently talking about, CS3D, is quite small. Even in Finland, it is about 135 companies. But the impacts of CS3D will be much more vast. And when we think about a company in the scope of CS3D, what they need to do is they need to identify the impacts, and then they need to act on those impacts. And now when we think about a business and we think about their suppliers or their logistics companies, these are separate company entities from them. So there's only one place that you can actually make sure someone follows your rules, and only one way to ensure that they act based on the set requirements you ask of them, and that's contracts. What we're really seeing is a huge change in what kind of ESG requirements are set for companies in those contracts. And I will talk a little bit more about that. But it's good to understand that for companies in CS3D, those contracts with your suppliers, with your logistics companies, with your storage companies will be at the heart of what you're actually going to be doing. The actual due diligence process that Christopher covered is obviously the process behind it all. But from a judicial and legal point of view, the one thing that legal teams will see in the next few years is contracts, what we require of companies and what we actually demand, how they follow them, how we audit them, and what kind of rules we set around that. Because when we ask another company to follow requirements that we have set around ESG, that has to happen through a contractual obligation. Now, supplier code of conducts have been here for a long time, and so have sustainability audits. But what we are seeing is a huge change in what those requirements are. Just saying that you act in a responsible way isn't cutting it for many leading big companies. They want you to join Science-Based Target Initiative. They want you to follow UNGPs clearly. They want you to have an impact assessment on human rights that you send forward. Then there's the whole other question of information requested for CSRD reporting. And then there's a third layer, which is the actual contractual elements. How do you secure the right to audit? Do you require indemnification if someone breaks the rules? How can you terminate a contract? And those then have a lot of questions currently around them. Now, because contracts are at the heart a lot at CSDDD, we will be expecting from the European Commission a guidance on voluntary model contract clauses. It's good to say that with Omnibus, this might not be the date, but this is the date currently written in the directive. There are also a lot of various NGOs, for example, that are giving model contract clauses, for example, the Responsible Contracting Project, and those give really good guidance for clauses that can be used. With that said, what we've noticed with a lot of these model contractual clauses is that they are very shared responsibility based, which is great from a sustainability point of view, because we obviously want shared responsibility between the companies and between the suppliers. But obviously, as an outside counsel, we also want to ensure that our clients are actually getting the compliance risks minimized in those contracts, and that sometimes means that the shared responsibility approach might not be the best. Now, don't take it just from me that contracts will be at the heart of CSDDD, it's also in the text. Article 10 and Article 11 in CSDDD specifically discuss potential adverse impacts and then also actual adverse impacts. And both of those specifically discuss getting contractual assurances from your direct business partner. This discusses having a code of conduct and a prevention action plan, but ensuring that that is actually part of your contract with them. Now, when we talk about Omnibus a bit later, there's a lot of focus on Tier 1 currently. And obviously, Tier 1 from a contract point of view is the main base, because contractual obligations typically happen between the company and Tier 1. How we actually then are able to put those requirements down the supply chain is then a different question. Now, as noted before, there are for the actual adverse impacts, there is also the same requirement. The only differentiation is whether it's a corrective action plan or prevention action plan in the wording. And it's good to remember that when companies make these kind of contractual clauses, there is also the expectation in CSDDD that they will verify that those are followed. And that means, like Christopher mentioned before, that really means audits. There are different ways to verify, but audits remain the main way to ensure verification of compliance. Now, interestingly, CSDDD also has this idea of indirect business partners contractual assurances. Now, will this change with Omnibus? It is possible, but currently in the text, it says that you may seek contractual assurances offered from indirect business partners. So meaning suppliers, for example, down the supply chain who are not your Tier 1, who you do not have a business contract with, but you would still go behind that Tier 1 supplier to Tier 2, Tier 3, why not even to the raw material, and seek a contractual assurance from them that specifically assures that they will stick to your requirements. Now, will this become very popular? We can't really be sure. But one thing that we do know from this is making this kind of contractual assurance with an indirect business partner. The articles also make very clear that in that instance, you also have to verify compliance. So if you decide to do this specific indirect business partner contract, you will have to verify compliance through audits in that situation as well. Now, for some extremely difficult raw materials, it may be a good idea. If there are specific raw materials or suppliers in geographical locations that are a specific risk for adverse impacts, it may be a good idea, instead of trying to get through your Tier 1 supplier, those down the line, to make sure that you have that contractual assurance. But what will really happen is that at the end of the day, a lot of CSDDD requirements will go down the supply chains to SME companies, specifically around Europe. Now, it's good to say that from a Finnish company perspective, when it comes to questions like occupational health and safety, Baltic countries tend to come higher in the risk categories. So, for example, companies in the Baltics in the SME sector might see a lot more requirements in contracts around that topic. Now, the EU is aware that big companies will try and push down a lot of those requirements into the supply chain. And for that reason, there are some rules around the role of SMEs. For example, the CSDDD talks about the SME contractual assurances having to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. I can say this is my personal favorite in the CSDDD text, because does that mean that to big companies, when they make a contract, it can be unfair and unreasonable and discriminatory? But the main idea is that when we have an SME that is being met with a big company who may be 80% of their revenue, it may be a company, a client that their business they cannot live on, who sets very specific ESG requirements that they possibly might not be able to meet, that they have the possibility to say that these rules need to be fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Similarly, if a CSDDD company is verifying compliance, the company, if it is carrying it out against an SME, has to carry the cost, unless if the SME participates, they have to be able to share those results with others. And these rules, if they come into force, it's really good to SMEs to remember that they should have some kind of possibility to say what rules are fair, reasonable, and they can meet. But it's also good to remember that we have contract freedom. That means that any company can really make any type of contract they want when it comes to the ESG rules. So how actually strictly will we actually be able to enforce through authorities, for example, the possibility that SME rules are fair? That will be seen in the practice in the future. But it is good to remember that there are specific rules around the fact that we want proportionality for SME requirements. So if you're on the other side of meeting CSDDD requirements, it is good to remember that. But I have to give a little word of warning. As much as we're talking about omnibus and changes to CSDDD, when it comes to contracts, the ship has left already. The ship has sailed. We are seeing a huge change in the contractual requirements big companies are setting in their supplier code of conduct. They are strict, they are clear, and they really require you to step up your game. They require decarbonization targets, for example, and for companies to meet them. The other is that companies want to ensure compliance, and for that reason, they are making sure that indemnification clauses, for example, go in if you break ESG rules. So as much as we're talking about CSDDD, companies are already moving in this topic, and it is good to be aware of whatever size company you are. Very quickly, we are seeing also a rise of ESG litigation. Disputes between parties are obviously coming up because we have tight ESG rules, and we have indemnification, we have reasonableness of these contracts being discussed, we have the possibility of misrepresentation of data that is coming from suppliers, and then the one presenting that data, for example, in their marketing for consumers is getting called out on it. So disputes are on the rise as well. So the world where companies, smaller companies, took a business risk and signed off on supplier code of conduct that they were not fully aware of or they knew they could not meet, it is time to stop doing that and taking that business risk, because there is a very clear compliance and dispute risk that is coming up with that as well. Good to remember when we're talking about disputes, obviously class actions, possibly under CSDDD or impact litigation in Europe. We don't have time to go to, are very different. Those happen in the court system. Also, we're talking about CSDDD today, but let's not forget about the other due diligence requirements we have. We have deforestation regulation in force and forced labor regulation coming in a few years. The forced labor regulation specifically applies to all products, regardless of the size of the company. All products brought into the EU or manufactured within the EU cannot be done with forced labor. It doesn't require due diligence as such. But what can happen is that those products can be withheld and investigated for 9 months by customs to ensure that no part of the supply chain included forced labor. Going down 5-6 parts of the chain to find out whether forced labor was used is incredibly difficult and expensive. This is one of the things we're also seeing in contracts, getting force majeure situations to understand that products might be withheld in customs while this long investigation occurs. A similar regulation is in the US, if you are aware. That works a little bit differently. It's actually the company who has to prove that there was no forced labor used, and that's even trickier. But good to remember forced labor coming in a few years, and understanding that due diligence is much bigger than just CSDDD. It involves also deforestation, conflict minerals, and forced labor, and the regulations around them. We're a bit on overtime, but let's use just 2-3 minutes to talk about Omnibus, because it is really what everyone is talking about, isn't it? Now, the current Omnibus proposal, I first of all want to remind everyone, it is a legislative proposal. It is not approved. The EU Commission cannot itself enforce any regulation. So every part of Omnibus will go into the EU Parliament and then to the Council, and when it is then published in an EU journal, officially in all the languages, it will come into force. And for those regulations that are directive, like CSDDD and CSRD, those will then need to be implemented into national law until they apply. So, for example, in Finland, CSRD has been transposed into national law, which also means that we will need national changes. Now, the vote that is happening in 2 weeks, that is not about the entire Omnibus. It is only about stop the clock. So it is only about the proposed postponement of CSRD for company waves 2 and 3, not for wave 1. That is likely to pass. All the other parts of Omnibus will still be up for debate and will be still discussed. And those changes, then we will see how they will come. But the important thing is now getting stop the clock through, so companies in the waves 2 and 3 of reporting have time to wait. Now, very quickly, there are some major changes in CSRD. There's first of all the stop the clock, but then there's also the possible changing of criteria of a large company, which would jump from 250 employees to 1,000 employees, and see the word and, either then 50 million in turnover or 25 in balance. But it means that any company under that 1,000 employee threshold would not be covered by CSRD. That includes a lot of companies. That includes about 80% of current CSRD companies. Voluntary reporting might become then very popular. We can talk about that during the panel. There will be some revisions to ESRS. On the CSDDD side, we're going to see a delay in the transportation and then in the application. The big thing is that the due diligence obligations would just focus on tier 1, not the entire chain, but very good to say, it says if there is plausible information of negative impacts. I promise you every company has plausible information of adverse and negative impacts further down their chain. Assessments would happen every 5 years. You wouldn't have an obligation to terminate any more business relationships. You would see the minimum penalties gone, and civil liability would be deleted, and it would go based on national rules. So the penalties and sanctions would specifically change. Same stakeholder would change, and it wouldn't, for example, include NGOs. What would this mean here? Well, CSRD is really the interesting one, as we have transposed it into national through amendments. We've already had the first companies report, and we currently are in our annual shareholders meeting era, where 25 companies in that wave are choosing their auditors for the year. What we will expect, though, is it has been made quite clear by the Finnish government that if it is now approved stop the clock, it will come into force here as well. On the CSDDD side, we have a working group that has been appointed, and we were expecting in the beginning of May a proposal that has now been delayed to wait to see what the Omnibus proposal changes will be. There's a lot of countries around Europe that have not transposed CSRD. We are a model country when it comes to regulation, and we did it straight away, and now we have to see how that will land. But it will be an interesting 6 months, let's see, to see what actually happens. With CSDDD, Finnish government have been clear that we follow EU regulation, so we will see what those changes will be. But that is it for me, and thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Leah. That was very insightful. And now let's move to our Q&A session. We have a couple of questions from our participants. One specific question regarding CSRD application is answered in the chat by my colleague Agita. But there is one question that I would like to address to Christopher, if I may. And one of our participants asks, is tangible data like money flow needed to create value chain framework? How it will be audited if some sectors are only based on stakeholder subjective opinion? Could you please comment on this, Christopher?
So I think from the point of assurance, it's a matter of collecting evidence that supports a claim. And then the assurance relies on what is the confidence of that claim. So I think when we speak about money flow, I think transactional financial data is more a matter of financial operators. So I'm not sure if I can address exactly that, but if it supports as part of a claim of non-financial data, then yes, it would be possibly relevant, but it will depend on the criteria and what the exact claim is. Sorry, speaking a little bit in abstract terms, but I think if the one raising the question can be concrete with the example, maybe I can also try to be more specific with my answer.
Yes, thanks, Chris. And another question, perhaps I can address it to Leah, since Leah, you mentioned specific risks for specific raw materials during your presentation, and I was wondering whether you would be able to answer to this one. Alberts is asking, now many EU companies import soybean meal and palm oil as raw materials for feed and food. These raw materials are from the third countries with environmental and other issues. How will such raw materials be treated in the context of CSDDD? For example, could the use of such feed negatively affect the livestock farms' positions in supply chains? And after Leah, you will share your views. Maybe Christopher, you will be able to comment on how do you, conduct this due diligence in third countries mentioned in the question. So Leah.
Yes, interesting question. So obviously from a deforestation regulation point of view that we haven't been talking about, those raw materials are then part of deforestation, and you need to know the actual geolocation and whether deforestation has occurred in that part where the raw material is from. So you already need to have quite a good understanding of your actual supply chain and the geolocation of that raw material. As I said before, I think it is good to remember that due diligence is a wider topic than just CSDDD, and that will encompass a lot of regulation, including deforestation. So harmonizing that as a regulatory strategy of due diligence is very smart. So not focusing on just deforestation solely or just CSDDD, but bringing it in together to really understand the impacts from kind of cradle to grave that raw material does have in your, whether it's production or what part of the chain you're in. Now, the deforestation regulation was, of course, postponed by a year. So we will see that being enforced by customs beginning of next year. So if that is something that you have those materials going through your operations, it's really important to be on top of that. And on the question of how you should see those, well, obviously, when we think about adverse impacts, it is good to understand the entire adverse impacts of your own business operations and your value chain has. And if there are some type of adverse impacts towards animal welfare, for example, those should be included. Good to remember, animal welfare itself is not covered by CSDDD, but biodiversity, for example, is. So having an in-depth understanding of what all these adverse impacts are, and maybe starting off with an impact assessment of what these impacts might be a good place to start, and then bringing all the regulatory requirements you have together under your due diligence process.
Thanks a lot, Leah. And maybe Chris, yes.
Yeah, I think Leah touched upon it very well. We are talking here also on another regulation that relates to the topics of the raw material, the European Deforestation Regulation as well here. So what it will require is, of course, you need to know the source of where you are buying, and from there you need to conduct a supply chain due diligence system to understand that you are and demonstrate that you are sufficiently mitigating risk, and and then also you need to prove on top of that that the products that you are actually importing are from the place you have your supply chain due diligence system, because otherwise, well, maybe it will be quite a hard argument that you can say, well, I have a supply chain system in one geographical location, but maybe my products come from elsewhere. So these things needs to be connected on top of that. So the actual goods value chain needs to mirror also the origin places to where you conduct your supply chain due diligence. And those areas can be, as the question suggests, places where there can be concerns around quality and social practices or sustainability goals. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Christopher. I have maybe a more general question to both of you. First, Christopher, and then maybe Leah. We are talking, well, as mentioned during the presentations, in the Baltics, few companies fall directly within the scope of CSDDD. But what proactive steps could be done by small or mid-cap enterprises if they are within the supply chain, and if they are, you know, subject to ESG due diligence, or they are negotiating contracts with companies that fall under the scope of CSDDD? How these smaller enterprises could, you know, prepare their internal processes or documentation to align with the requirements. Could you please comment, Christopher?
Yeah, I think everyone is now part of large global, complex global value chains. So the ones that are local in Baltics have to look at what sector they are in and which specific risk that are inherent in such sectors. So we talked before about material goods, which are falling under European Deforestation Regulation, but there can also be other sectors with other, let's say, inherent risk. I think for companies supplying to larger corporations, more transparency in their operations will be required, more understanding and evidence that the risks are being addressed is also much needed. So we, as a company providing independent services, we do believe in the credibility around such steps to undertake. So that can be from the GST accounting of the company's footprint to be able to communicate this in a verified way towards the buyer, who ultimately needs to report upstream emissions, and the supplier is a scope 3 emissions factor. So for the big corporation to report, having verified the data in the supply chain is definitely helpful. And for the suppliers to start, they can start also understanding their risks, and that would be my suggestion. Maybe more to comment from you.
Yes, then maybe Leah, you could comment on this from your experience.
Yes, happy to. I think there's 3 points. I think there's the general point of what the expectation is on the market currently. As Christopher said, it's good to remember CSDDD. It is based on the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. So there's a lot of guidance already there for voluntary frameworks of what's expected in a due diligence process. So if your company doesn't have a clear due diligence process currently, going back to those voluntary frameworks and their guidance and kind of finding of those. The second one is the fact that obviously each sector might have a little bit different expectations, understanding a little bit who your clients are, even if they're down the chain more, of understanding what their expectation is, having maybe an open dialogue about it, but also looking through what you've signed, honestly, going back a little bit and looking what those supplier code of conducts, for example, actually require you to do, which seems to still be a very big issue here in Northern Europe. We believe that, oh, we do the right thing, we'll just sign up on the supplier code of conduct, and haven't really looked at what kind of expectations there are. And the third thing is I'll mention, just because I do a lot of M&A, and obviously in Northern Europe, the targets tend to be more SME. But when you have big investments or you have a bigger company doing the transactions, they do ESG due diligence now. And there are certain red flags that tend to always come up. It's those missing supplier code of conduct for the smaller companies. SMEs now are expected also to look after who their suppliers is. Like I talked about before, it is a contract chain. So the big guys want to know what's happening behind. There's also the question of, do you understand your risk? Is there someone in charge of ESG? Do you understand occupational health and safety, labor law, your environmental permits, the overall regulatory aspects of ESG? And those type of red flags for SMEs tend to come up, and they don't need always fancy, expensive fixes. They need small things internally, a little bit more focus on writing a supplier code of conduct, making an ESG framework in the management team, dividing and conquering on these topics. So not everything has to be a quick, expensive fix by a third party. It can really be the smaller SME focusing and thinking what's being required of them, where they should be, and what their maturity level really is, and how to get it a little bit up without bigger investments.
Thanks a lot, Leah. And then, well, I have a question then for both our lawyers. First, maybe for Agita, and then maybe again for you, Leah. It is widely, mentioned and stressed that the omnibus suggests to remove EU-specific EU-wide liability regime, for the breaches of the requirements. However, am I correct to say that the national directors and officers' liability regimes remain in place, and still, the directors of the companies may be held liable if they, so to say, ignore ESG risks that companies face? Agita, could you please comment on that?
Thanks. Indeed, yes, the director's liability initially was included in the draft CS3D proposal, but eventually it was left out for national legislation, and at least in the Baltics we see the rise of director's liability cases, and I suppose the same goes Europe-wide, and I guess there is an increase of market for insurance of directors and officers' liability.
Yes, thanks, Agita. And maybe Leah, from your experience, do you see such cases in Finland? You mentioned just signing on, various ESG related requirements, not reading them, and I understand that one cannot do this anymore.
Yeah, so we are definitely seeing a rise in disputes, as I said, between companies. The so-called ESG disputes are definitely on the rise as well. From a litigation point of view, it's good to say that obviously now the civil liability aspect would be taken away by Omnibus. This is a change the Finnish government is very happy about, I have to say. Let's not get too deeply into it, but obviously Omnibus does, CS3D does include those ILO core conventions, so ILO employee rights. We have a pretty, if anyone follows Finnish politics, we've had for the few years a pretty stringent employee and employer union situation, and we've had a fair amount of strikes. So there has been quite a rising fear that a CS3D gives the right of a victim to give a labor union the right to drive their case in the court system, that we would have seen a huge rise in impact litigation based on employee rights. So this change will be very happy for our government, let's say that. From the litigation point of view, Finland is never the most attractive forum for litigation. Our court system is quite long, and we have a very stringent procedural law system. So we aren't seeing this huge wave of impact litigation. Similarly, we obviously have in our Limited Liabilities Companies Act, we do have the management responsibility management due diligence requirements. And if there is a law that is enforced, a compliance issue, obviously that is covered by it. But similar thing, that kind of shareholder court proceedings around that haven't been very attractive in Finland, but we're obviously keeping an eye on it. They are huge all around Europe. We have big companies like BNP Paribas, for example, in Europe in these impact litigation cases, and we speak to a lot of NGOs who are solely focused currently on getting funded for impact litigation and making their case in the court system. And from a lawyer's perspective, those are really hard cases because they don't want to win, they don't want to settle, they want to make impact and make a lot of noise. But Finland as a forum is not attractive, but let's see, it could change very quickly as well.
Yes, thanks a lot. And of course, the business defending such a claim faces, huge also reputational damage. That's, one more argument to, understand the impacts, the risks, and to mitigate them in advance. Maybe last question again, perhaps for you, Leah. It is also, stressed that with Omnibus, the scope of the maximum harmonization will be extended in Europe, meaning that, companies do not face different requirements from their, partners from various jurisdictions. Is it correct? What are your views on that?
Yes, so currently CS3D already has articles 10 and 11 and 12. There's 4 articles that are covered by maximum harmonization, which means that the member state transposing it is not allowed to go any further. Now, I feel like this was a trick question in the sense that 5 years ago, I wrote my PhD where I said that there will be a CS3D-like directive, and through Brussels effects will go wider and end up being kind of the market practice globally. So I obviously have a personal opinion quite strongly about this. But even 5 years ago, it was very clear that it is because of harmonization that CS3D is here. We've had national laws in France, in Germany, in Norway. So we've had national laws that already require some type of due diligence process. And that has really left a patchwork of regulation, which is always really bad in the EU. That in some countries you have to follow some rules and some not. So the idea of harmonization is at the heart of CS3D. It's supposed to be a minimum harmonization tool, so directives usually allow the member state transposing it to go further. In this situation, they will extend that maximum harmonization from the 4 articles to further. And it's really to ensure that there will be no more stringent regulations around due diligence Europe-wide. Usually harmonization is for a minimum standard, but that seems to be the omnibus deregulation method of kind of setting that cap in this situation. And what we really need, if we're being honest, we need clarity on regulation. We are doing real injustice for European companies by setting the last few years some really stringent compliance rules and now walking it back and saying maybe it's going to come, maybe it's not. So the fear is of why make this investment towards compliance when it might change again in a year. So getting all of this regulation now transposed and enforced, and whether it's with maximum harmonization to get one actual leveled playing field for everyone in Europe, I think is the goal and should be the goal for everyone.
Thanks, Leah. I can see that we have some very specific questions related to CSRD reporting in the chat. So Sorainen would be happy to answer those directly via email. You can write that question to our organizers. There was an email address in the registration. And the last question I would like to address to Christopher, not from the legal perspective, but more from business or supply chain assurance perspective. Our audience is asking that some suppliers refuse to sign the supplier code of conduct. What to do in such situations? How to ensure a sustainable, transparent supply chain? We lawyers have answers. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I note the question. I think it's a tricky bit. I mean, first of all, the supplier code of conduct have to be done in a fair way. Let's say like that. But if we are to take for granted that there is good intent and good content in the supplier code of conduct, then there clearly seems to be an issue if a supplier is not willing to work along the criteria demanded. So I think that this is of course something of an issue between two parties, but if supplier is not on board on the sustainability journey, I would question how resilient you as a buyer from the supplier will be in the future, because as more and more demanding regulations will require you to ask more and more things from your supplier. If they already by now starts to show signs that they are not transparent about their operation, they cannot disclose responsible and ethical practices, maybe they do not have a management system with good controls, maybe they are simply not mature and ready for meeting the sustainability and requirements going forward. I think, but actively working with your suppliers, understanding where is the gap can be a helpful thing, and maybe guiding suppliers to how they can improve their sustainability strategy and operations is possibly a way forward. Depends also what type of the supplier. Is it a logistics supplier? Is it a supplier of raw material or final products? I mean, there are also different nuances for sure in that conversation. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Christopher. And time is running, so I would like to thank you, dear speakers, and thanks all participants for joining us today for this webinar. We hope that you found the presentations and the discussions valuable and gained some deeper understanding of the latest developments and their implications for your business. Well, we remain committed at Sorainen to supporting you in navigating the complex landscape of ESG regulations. Stay connected with us through our newsletters and future webinars. Thanks once again, dear all, for your time and engagement, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Have a great day.